One thing that's for sure more certain to appeal to humans than cowboys are dinosaurs. So why not have both in the same game? Further proof Rockstar are marketing geniuses. However, there aren't many fossils we can discover that are actually genuine dinosaur bones. In fact, there are only 2 official dinosaur bone fragments we can find in Red Dead Redemption 2. Not to say that the rest of the prehistoric remains Arthur is tasked to find are boring or uninteresting, exactly the opposite. There's plenty more exciting finds for both paleontology and history nerds, like myself. It should come as no surprise to regular viewers here, as I've stated many times before that I am a functioning dinosaur fiend. An addiction that started, basically, in my infancy. I came out with a fossil in my hand. On a more serious note, it's insane from at least a historical aspect how much this fossil hunt in the game mimics real-life events that happened in America during the 19th century. A boom in the fossil industry led to a ridiculous feud in our country's young life known as the Bone Wars. For anyone who may be unfamiliar with what the Bone Wars were about, no, it's not about boning anyone. I'll give you a brief rundown about it before explaining how it is integrated into Red Dead Redemption 2's story. From the late 1870s through early 1890s, an intense rivalry between 2 scientists, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, led to the discovery of many new species of dinosaur, as well as many intentional misidentifications that would take around another 100 years to correct. The conflict began when the 2 men's partnership started experiencing volatile internal turbulence, and both sought to ruin the other's career through various attempts of property destruction, bribery, theft, espionage, and just flat out meanness, man. The competition was fierce, unethical, and unfair. Cope and Marsh were so concerned with releasing a publication before the other could do so, that these rushed reports resulted in several significant errors regarding their portrayals and descriptions of dinosaurs. One would make a discovery, hastily reconstruct the animal, often incorrectly, and release the report for publication. In response, the other would reconfigure the same creature's bones and then release a counter-report nullifying the previous one's work. The problem was, in their rush to discover more species than their rival, several of them were either incorrectly identified or reconstructed. Truth is, they just made it up most of the time. Both of their foolishness eventually destroyed their reputation and credibility. Even in death, they sought to issue one final challenge, as Cope's final wishes were to have his brain observed to prove if it was larger than Marsh's. From what I understand, this never actually occurred because Marsh just refused to have that done. In the end, the pursuit of paleontological supremacy ruined both of them financially. So by now you may be asking yourself, what is this guy yapping on about? How in the hell does this have anything to do with Red Dead? Well, it appears Rockstar might have actually utilized the Bone Wars as a source of inspiration for the fossil collection quest Arthur R. John is tasked with for Deborah McGinnis. This cuckoo quack more than likely was influenced by a real-life paleontological pioneer, or sometimes even known as the mother of modern paleontology. Her name was Mary Anning. Her theories, discoveries, and contributions to the study of dinosaurs led to groundbreaking changes and understandings of prehistoric life on Earth. Other than the marvelous giant marine reptiles that were unearthed in the early 1800s by Anning, her most impressive accomplishment was finding the first coprolite specimens. And in case you're not sure what that is, it's fossilized caca. But how exactly does she relate to Deborah McGinnis? She's obviously a nut, while Mary was an actual genius. Well, of course it has to be parodied. It wouldn't be a Rockstar game without it. In personality, they're completely polar opposites, but there are still some similarities that can be spotted. Obviously, a lot of Deborah's appearance was inspired by the many famous paintings and portraits of Mary Anning. Just look at her hat, colors of clothing, and even her facial features. See the resemblance? But not only that, Deborah's struggles for recognition from the scientific community are constantly ignored and challenged. This was a historically accurate bias women faced in the 19th century. At times, she had even had spies come to sabotage her, indicated by her suspicions of Arthur invading her dig site.
Did the university send you?
Excuse me?
Because if they did, they can get lost. I have never been so insulted in all my life. Really, laughed at. Balderdash.
What are you doing?
Are you quite certain you're not a spy?
A spy?
Those wretches will do anything to destroy me. My theories are correct, and I can prove it!
This itself could be another reference to the espionage and other unethical tactics used by those dongheads Marsh and Cope, as I mentioned a few moments ago. This entire stranger mission historically did in fact happen. So thinking about it, was this the first based on a true story mission? How so, you may ask yourself? Because I say so! Arthur's challenge of finding the long-lost bones to prehistoric giants parallels with the story of Dan Baldwin. No, not those Baldwins. In the midst of the Bone Wars, tensions between the whites and the natives increased as frequent Native American war parties, led by the fierce Geronimo, ravaged through the regions of Arizona and New Mexico. There was just no safe way to proceed with the fossil hunting. Fearful for their own lives, enemies Marsh and Cope would both individually require the services of the skilled gun and outdoorsman Dan Baldwin. Marsh initially had hired Baldwin to collect for him until there was a quarrel over payment. And that's when Baldwin, already fueled by a bitter partnership, would pledge his allegiance to Cope. His new employer's instructions were simple and clear. Find more bones than Marsh so he could make a bigger name for himself while destroying Marsh's career at the same time. He'd often be seen to disappear for months at a time as he embarked into the Badlands and various other treacherous landscapes to retrieve Cope's fossils. At times, even in the middle of a blistering cold winter up north, and he would still manage to return back with a wagon or even boxcar loaded with bones. Baldwin's efforts produced the first bones of a creature that would later be identified as Coelophysis, a Triassic creature that is recognized for being an early ancestor of the dinosaurs, theropod dinosaurs to be precise. So basically some lone cowboy, unafraid of the elements, Indians or whatever, was hired to find dinosaur remains for a scientist. Sounds and looks a lot like this quest, don't it? Now, although natives were the main reason for mercenaries and hired guns alike, the northern tribes were actually quite peaceful with Cope's nemesis, Othniel Charles Marsh. In the years preceding the Bone Wars, Marsh lived quite a life of excitement and adventure, riding shotgun on the American Great Plains, hanging out with Buffalo Bill and Sitting Bull, and literally being accepted by the Sioux Nation as a blood brother. They referred to him as Wakasa Paihihuhu, which translates to he who digs up bones. It was through the Sioux that Marsh would be told stories of mysterious beasts hidden beneath the earth's soil. It may be hard to imagine a pre-literate society to know anything about dinosaurs or prehistoric life in general, but indeed almost all tribes had stories and explanations for the behemoth remains they'd find eroding out of the earth. Stories of thunderbirds and thunder horses, as they'd call them. Interestingly, it was Marsh's first time to see the giant beast that the Sioux brought for him to examine. Coincidentally, being a relative of the horse, he named the creature in honor of the Sioux Nation's stories by giving it the title of a Brontotherium, or in other words, a thunder beast. Not impressed? Here's something that might. These stories were preserved through oral traditions over the course of potentially thousands of years, and inaugurated an understanding of a previous era in the Earth's history where humans did not exist and monsters did. An impressive conclusion that they were able to establish was that the mainland United States was at one time underwater, which we now know is actually true. They were able to interpret the various plesiosaur skeletons as ocean-dwelling creatures when they found their remains amongst other fossilized marine animals like fish, shells, and turtles. This is something that's also quickly referenced in Red Dead 2 when Deborah correctly described the plains as being a shallow inland sea.
This state was once a vast, shallow sea that had the most incredible animal that could walk, swim, and fly.
Last seen in the late Cretaceous period, the western interior seaway would disappear with the formation of the Rocky Mountains, also seen in Red Dead Redemption 2. I don't know if this is necessarily another reference to the western interior seaway, but in the big valley just on the other side of the mountain that you can see in the background with Deborah are the skeletal remains of a large sea creature. I don't know if this is a whale or not, as whales were non-existent during the Cretaceous, but they were during the late Eocene and so forth. All the way up into the Miocene epoch was a shallow receding sea in far western states like California. In this region of map is an area called tall trees. It closely resembles the redwood trees found in California's national parks, so that could be further evidence of the bones belonging to an early species of whale. I'm no paleontologist or qualified in any way to identify this animal, but it looks very similar to a sperm whale's bones to me. If you have any idea what this is, please let me know in the comments. Also, something worth mentioning is that there are another set of whale bones in the desert. We'll talk more about that in another video. Once all of the bones are collected, we are treated to a final encounter with Deborah, where she presents the final reconstruction of the creature named
Totalosaurus West Elizabethus. the Elizabethan megasaur.
That's quite a monster.
Now, you don't have to be a paleontologist to notice something right here. What she calls the Totalosaurus is really just a bunch of mixed up bones of different species of mammals. It reminds me of the many deliberately false interpretations of prehistoric animals in the 19th century. All just so greedy scientists could benefit from the financial gain. In other words, just big fat phonies! One specific individual that comes to mind is Albert C. Koch and his famous Missouri Leviathan, or the Missourium, I think is how you pronounce that, which appears to have been some type of elephant creature that Koch described as being a fearsome predator that would stab its prey like a deranged serial killer. Of course, many people from back then had very little, if any, knowledge at all about non-local or national wildlife, and therefore could be easily deceived into believing this was indeed a real creature. What were they gonna do, Google it? So naturally, I can see how the Totalosaurus has its similarities to the Missouri Leviathan. However, the only difference is that Albert C. Koch deliberately presented his specimen falsely for profit, while Deborah is just a literal wacko, claiming she managed to piece together the remains of an ancient creature that could walk, swim, and fly. I guess you ain't never heard of ducks. I'll make another video explaining all the different bone species and if their positions found are geologically accurate. What eventually ended up happening with Deborah is very similar to Albert C. Koch. You'll find in one of the newspaper articles that she fulfilled her eager ambitions to display her final constructed project, but ultimately was met with criticism and doubt as some viewers were quick to point out the obvious mismatch of different bones. A near identical outcome to Koch's Missourium, as the world-renowned Richard Owen exposed the beast as a terrible misrepresentation of a mastodon. While on the subject of mastodons and mammoths, did you know that we are able to find the skeletal remain of a huge mammoth in Red Dead Redemption 2? High in the Grizzlies between Dead Boot Creek and Spider's Gorge, if memory serves correctly, are the set of perfectly preserved bones, in which Arthur or John can draw as a point of interest in their journal. Tell me, whose drawing is better? However, I do think it would be pretty neat to mention that this could be the fossil of not that of a woolly mammoth, but of a much larger species known as a Columbian mammoth. They were apparently much more common in the United States than woolly mammoths, but I'd say it's still very possible for this to be a woolly mammoth. Something equally as massive, but certainly more terrifying, are these bones found in one of the networks of caves underneath Mount Shawn. This absolutely massive skull can be found spotted amongst the other scattered remains when looking for the elusive snow white cougar, or you can simply find these here during free roam. This monstrous head is truly astounding when you finally realize just how large it really is. Here's a comparison to a regular human skull. So now the question becomes, just what the hell is that? As I stated before, I am no expert, but I do share a particular fondness for history and prehistoric beasts. That's an understatement. I'm a dinosaur freak! But I do somewhat have a hunch that this skull belongs to an extinct genus of bear, scientifically known as the giant short-faced bear. They were seldom wanderers, much like modern-day bears, especially their closest living relatives, the grizzly. But unlike a normal grizzly, which is bad enough, they stood 6 feet tall just on all fours. You could only imagine the monstrous size it must have been when it reared on its hind legs. However, the only issue I have with this assumption is the unusual jaw. It's very uncharacteristic of a common bear's jaws. If anything, I get the impression of something more crocodilian, which is nightmarish to think about. Normal bear jaws are a lot smaller in proportion to the rest of the head. However, this one seems to be the same size all around, with teeth that overlap the lip from the outside, like a crocodile. I have another theory that explains these creepy bear heads that sounds completely insane, but at the same time also very plausible. And it does involve another secret that can be found in the same area. I think that would be perhaps too much for one video to talk about and would deviate from the subject, but definitely is something that I'll consider making soon. Thanks for watching this video if you made it this far, and if you did enjoy it, please consider leaving a like, it really does help. If not for me, do it for the dinosaurs. Everyone loves dinosaurs. Share the video with another dinosaur freak if you learned something new. That's the best way to help the channel out. And lastly, if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe for Red Dead content like this and much, much more. Adios, amigos.
I was right, of course. Quite right.